From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth and to inform, educate and entertain, all with dignity, integrity and indeed respect. And it's vital that we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. Well, ever since the wonderful J.D. Vance has come out and talked about free speech and how that's on critical support, we've been looking at that all week, and we thought we'd expand that and look a bit more at media manipulation and basically the erosion of free speech. And we've got the best of the best to come along as guests today to help me do that. Both of whom I've worked with many more platforms than Paddington, so it's good to see them back here live on The Pulse today. Eve Tawfick has a decade of experience in journalism and media with diverse knowledge and a passion for the industry. She's worked with many organisations in mainstream media, and her experience covers print media and online. And a pair of briefs, well, that's the programme that I present with Stephen Barrett, who is a fellow lawyer. He basically loves law, is what he says. He's an experienced commercial barrister in big money cases in court and indeed in arbitration, mostly in London, but also around the world. And that requires him to have a broad and deep understanding of the law. So he was uniquely placed to become, in 2019, the writer on law for the Spectator. His greater achievement was spotting in a German case about the bond market the germ of what has become the EU rule of law crisis, which is still ongoing. He's also a passionate scholar of UK constitutional law. Eve and Stephen, welcome.
Hello, Andrew.
It's good. Now, we've been looking at the basically free speech and the erosion of free speech and J.D. Vance's comments about that being a much bigger threat than Russia or China and so on and so forth. And I always say that trust comes in on foot and leaves on horseback. Well, trust in the media, trust in politicians, trust in the police is at an all-time low. And indeed, Statista, we had a look at that sort of side. Finland, they say trust in the media is at 69%, but in the UK, it's at 36%. Why do you think it's so bad, Eve?
Several reasons. Lovely to see you again, Andrew.
Always good to see you.
Several reasons. I think people have lost trust in neoliberalism as a concept, and with that, the media that has served them so well over the years, or not so well in some cases. Often, I think people are placing their trust in social media, unfortunately, which initially sprung forth to give, the regular man a voice, but now I fear has become a cesspit in which people self-censor.
Stephen?
Yes, I mean, it's always difficult. I think skepticism of the media is a wise thing, and I quite like skepticism generally. It leads to a healthier and slightly more critical society. I don't really want people trusting the media, to be perfectly honest. But what I would say is that our media has got particularly bad in the United Kingdom in particular. The thing that we all grieve for is what's happening to the BBC, because that is sad. I mean, if you grow up here, you are culturally sort of indoctrinated, if you like, into loving the BBC. And it's becoming very hard to still love it because it's really, really shocking. There was a documentary put out yesterday, which was obviously biased and obviously propaganda nonsense, and it's just getting very upsetting that this keeps happening to something that we're all supposed to care about.
So talk to me, what was that documentary? Tell us about that one.
That was about Gaza. So, but it was just, I mean, it can be shown that there are actors involved. We know that there are pro-Hamas people involved. It's a joke. It's not even difficult to spot. It's a bit like our government continuing to fund UNRWA when we all know that really all the aid goes to Hamas people, not to the innocent suffering Gazans. It's tragic.
Yeah, no. I mean, and it is important to call it out. And as we always say, we've got to question everything. Now, George Orwell, he said, look, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Eve, talk to me about J.D. Vance's comments then at this Security Council, because he took a lot of people by surprise. As opposed to talking about security, he was saying, look, the threats that we've got here to free speech are much bigger than the threats we have from China or Russia. What was your take on that?
I mean, where to start? So I find it funny what he didn't say, actually. He omitted the fact that Trump and Putin had a nice catch-up call this week. So he didn't mention that one, despite the fact that Russia has been said to be an ongoing threat. Well, we know to be an ongoing threat. Also, you raised the point about Gaza, Stephen. Also, 200 journalists were killed in Gaza, Palestinian journalists, would like to add, doing their job, trying to share the story of Gaza with the world. And in general, what Vance is saying, in which the director of international affairs of the EU said was a perverse twist on liberal democracy, what he's essentially saying is that nations that have built themselves on and prided themselves on a sort of modicum of free speech are now being compared to authoritarian regimes, which is quite frankly ridiculous from my point of view anyway. But when you do see it that on the other side, I have questioned whether people have lost faith in liberal democracy, and that's where this stems from. And as I said before, is fueled by social media. And I feel that with the failings of liberal democracy come the populist effects. So you've got Trump, you've got Vance. I mean, Vance was calling out the abortionist Smith Connor, the Bournemouth abortion campaigner who was spotted kneeling in prayer outside a clinic. This has been taken and vilified by Vance as such. I don't know what your take on that is, Andrew and Stephen.
Well, I think sometimes the press slightly misreport what's happening there, because it was reported that he was arrested because he was in silent prayer. Actually, the reality was there was an exclusion zone around the abortion clinic, and he basically breached that exclusion zone, and that was the reason for the arrest rather than the prayer. Is that a fair summary, Stephen?
No, and I think we just need to step away from this overly technical approach. There is another case in Scotland where they literally say to the woman, "We're arresting you for silent prayer." That is grotesque. That is thought crime. I don't care what your religion is. You should be allowed to pray in your head. And abortion is a particularly tricky issue. I always dislike the idea of turning it into something simplistic. That strikes me as slightly mildly cultish behavior. I approve of anti-abortion laws up to a point. I can see the argument for bodily integrity for women overrides the right of the baby up until a point, and I can see that it's a difficult moral question for every society to deal with. I don't think it should be turned into an absolute black and white. It's never helpful to get that brittle. But what I'd say on JD Vance is that you've got to remember, when it comes to being British, we are much more grounded in a fundamental right of the right to private property. And that's very largely because we were abused for a very long time by these awful Norman overlords who would come and nick our stuff. So when you're used to living with a bunch of people who will come and nick your stuff, you really focus on property rights being the most important thing. The Americans, they came later. They came after property rights had been established. So they started to obsess about free speech. And for them, free speech is an absolute pillar. They really do care about it. In a way, it's never been that important to us. It is important. What I don't think we should do,
absolutely important.
Yes, but what I don't think we should do is have thought crimes. And there I would just echo Elizabeth I. We cannot make windows into men's souls. One of the awful things for these people is that they are only getting prosecuted because they admit that they were praying in their head because they're honest people. They're literally being punished for being honest. If they were dishonest people, they'd just say, "Nope, I wasn't praying, officer. Nope, definitely not praying, officer." But because they're so
and I think it's really important. What I love about unpacking things on this show is that we can actually get to the nub of the issue, if you like. We've got time to do it. But what they will say, and just to be clear on this, was there or was there not an exclusion zone around that particular place?
Well, that's what. So you can silently pray in anywhere that isn't an exclusion zone. So they created this
but that's
concept.
the point, because you're right. If you just focus on the silent prayer, then of course it's abhorrent and you must be able to pray whether silently or otherwise. But what they're focusing on here is actually that particular place, because of troubles they had beforehand, just playing devil's advocate, they had put an exclusion zone. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's an exclusion zone around every abortion clinic by law.
this has become a case of the exclusion zone is being used as a good excuse to arrest people for silent prayer. If you say the words exclusion zone, you then impart, officiality, bureaucracy, with, you shall not pass kind of mentality. And
Yeah.
just a thought on Elizabeth I, she wasn't around in the age of the computer, and the window into man's soul is a blue one called Facebook. So, yeah.
It is interesting. So your view, and they're using this sort of exclusion zone. Firstly, there was an exclusion zone, which is why they've got that extra side to it as well. But secondly, you're saying that it's wrong anyway, that people should be able to protest even if it's silent prayer. Stephen?
I don't.
Yes, I mean, we have the right to protest. I mean, I think that went too far in a case called Ziegler, which clogged up the Met Police with the Just Stop Oil protesters. But the extent to which the Just Stop Oil protesters go, if there are people who are, and I always like to say, you quoted George Orwell. I prefer Voltaire, which is that, I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. I'm openly bisexual and could be in a relationship with a man, and I could get married. There are people who don't approve of same-sex marriage, and I've always said that that's entirely their right to believe that if they want to. It's not going to hurt me. It's not going to impinge me. It's not even going to take away my legal right, because I've got a legal right and I'll damn well defend that. But if that's what they want to feel, then they should be allowed to do it. And it comes out in politicians. I hated the way that what's his face, Tim, oh God, I can't remember his name now, who led the Lib Dems for a while, got hounded out because he's a devout Christian, so he doesn't really approve of abortion. It's like, okay, that's his private personal belief. Leave him be. That there's no need to force consistency. There's no need to force people to start, clapping around saying everything's absolutely marvelous. People are going to disagree. That's what a grown-up society does. And I'd like to get us back to agreeing to disagree and to going, well, it's a free country. You believe what you want.
Yeah, I mean, and that's absolutely got to be right. I mean, people always quote, they always say it's Voltaire. It actually wasn't Voltaire. It was in a book which were the Friends of Voltaire, published in 1906, and the author was Evelyn Beatrice Hall. But the sentiment was there. If they're chums of Voltaire, I guess that's okay. But you're absolutely right, and this is what we're trying to do: is you need an educated debate, and if you don't listen to all sides of an argument, you can't have that debate. We're going to come back to get Eve's thoughts on this straight after these messages. You're watching The Pulse today.
Critically analyzing global affairs, the Muckrakers. Today's news talk, The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, joined today by Eve Tawfick and Stephen Barrett. And we're looking at media manipulation and the restrictions of the media. One of the big things that makes people burst a blood vessel is about the reporting of legal cases and what's allowed to be done and not allowed to be done. Stephen, talk us through the law as it currently stands.
Well, what I'd say is that there is a great deal of hysteria about the reporting of legal cases. If anybody watching this saw, we had to just deal with a very high profile case in the United Kingdom, and what came out of that was the robustness and strength of the judge, a man called Mr. Justice Goose. And you cannot watch Mr. Justice Goose and worry for the justice system. No tweet is going to derail a trial that Mr. Justice Goose is in charge of. No Facebook post is going to cause issues. And I think we do need to have a certain degree of robustness. What we do is we fuss a bit over juries. The Americans do this too. The Americans tend to sequester juries. So whilst they're sitting on a trial, they'll all be put up in a hotel and therefore kept away from the outside world and protected, if you like. We don't go that far. We just give them a warning. But it's being used, the risk to juries is, I think, being used by a particularly legal politician at the moment, our prime minister, and I think he does it more to silence people and to scare people into staying silent. He doesn't like opposing views or ideas that he thinks that are inconvenient being aired. That's really what's going on with this alleged, weakness of Mr. Justice Goose, which is just nonsense. I have a lot of experience. I have, 22 years experience with Her Majesty's or His Majesty's judges, and they are very like Mr. Justice Goose. They are not going to be derailed in any way. So I think that we need to be more robust about it. That doesn't mean I want people going around on social media spreading lies and just saying absolute nonsense. But I just think we don't need to be quite so hysterical. Controlling people by fear seems to have become an addiction for various governments. And I think we should always sort of laugh at it. That's what Churchill said. If you're surrounded by tyrants, Churchill said, laugh. It's the one thing they really can't stand.
No, well, we're certainly trying to make sure that laughter is in the current climate. You either laugh or you cry. But just to set the law in perspective, what it is, there's what they call the Contempt of Court Act 1981 over here, and there are automatic restrictions once proceedings are active. So once a person's been arrested, charged, or a warrant is issued, the media cannot publish anything that could prejudice these proceedings. And that's the test. As you say, the judiciary themselves, it's unlikely that anything could prejudice them, but they're worried about the juries. What's your take on it, Eve?
I've got many takes as usual. And yes, laughter, absolutely. And just 10 years on from the Charlie Hebdo massacre, where we said, I will defend my right to, to laugh, to joke, to laugh at oneself, and how it went from, my right to offend to I'm offended within just 10 short years. My take on this with the British press especially is that, we have certain laws and codes, obviously the IPSO code, which protects the newspaper buyer as such and the person who you're interviewing from, being victimized through news, as say could happen in America, where the freedom of speech laws are slightly different. I certainly, throughout my career, I've gone to interview multiple people, and they've acted very, but oh no, don't take this, don't take that. I cannot take anything from you as a journalist. I have to ask. Images you provide me, they're your images that you choose to give me. If you place them publicly, I can use them up to a point. We do have laws that within journalism that we have to abide by. I mean, most large newspapers within the country will have a very hot legal team who sometimes will take days raking over a singular article based on a TikTok post to make sure that it's fit to go. And even then, you could still be sued. Number one mantra of every editor is, "I'm not in the business of being sued." So this is how we deal with things. And I think it's really integral to the understanding of the press that, and I think this is lost. We're not sitting in bushes stealing what we can from pockets and taking pictures of you in the bath. That's not how it goes. But I think that's often the image of the British press because of the paparazzi, because of issues like Princess Diana, because of invasion of privacy, which I do not agree with and I'm not on the side of. That's a huge reason why people have come to lose trust in the British media. And as a journalist, I'm very sad to say that I understand them. So that's one angle.
I think you're absolutely right. I always say that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and the reason about justice and so on and so forth is justice should not just be done but seen to be done. And this is why there were a lot of people campaigning to get sentencing remarks basically broadcast. And the first of those was on the 22nd of July 2022, when Judge Sarah Munro, she sentenced Ben Oliver for manslaughter. It was the first ever filmed sentencing at the Bailey, and it was a new era of basically open justice. So it was enabled by the Crown Court Recording Broadcasting Order of 2020. It compares pretty poorly still, though, with the US, which has wall-to-wall coverage of things like the O.J. Simpson trial and Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, which got everybody riveted. What are your views on TV or not TV, Stephen?
So the constitutional concept is that the public should be involved in everything. So you'll know that my Substack is called the Public Gallery, and I consider the Public Gallery to be part of our constitution as the United Kingdom. The public should be everywhere. There's a public gallery in Parliament, in both of its houses. There's a public gallery in the House of Lords, a public gallery in the House of Commons, and there's a public gallery in almost every court because the public are welcomed in. What you then crash headlong into is good old-fashioned British snobbery, which is the idea that cameras and television are just disgraceful and absolutely awful. They will cheapen everything. You can't, let's look at that contrast. We have public galleries everywhere. You're literally welcome to go into any court and sit there and see everything. They won't try and restrict you. The usher will help you out. The usher will get you in, and you'll sit there and you can. And the only time, by the way, a member of the public's ever been in one of my hearings, they left after about 10 minutes, no doubt out of crushing boredom. But they are in theory welcome.
Point, because People when they go into court, the reality is they're so tainted, if you like, or with high expectations because they see the TV and film version of court proceedings, which are far more dramatic than they are actually when you sit through the live things, aren't they?
Yes, but how you can maintain a consistent intellectual position against cameras in court and yet say that the public are all perfectly welcome in. It is just classic British snobbery. Fortunately, we now have another thing to be snobbish about, which is tablets and phones. So because we can all be snobby about them, cameras might start appearing more in courts. I don't think it's a consistent position. I doubt anybody would watch any of my hearings, but I've got no objection to it. And if anything, the judiciary have been looking very weak from a problem that isn't theirs, which is that sentencing is not their choice. And so there are lots of sentences the public are not approving of, particularly things like paedophilic images. The public are not happy about the fact that those men are walking out of court. To be perfectly honest, neither am I. But that's not the judge's fault. And I think it was good for the public to see Mr. Justice Goose because he was so obviously just what you want a judge to be that actually filming him was a very good idea.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and it's also gone further than that. I know a number of people who were involved with it. Originally, Sky wrote and basically said that it's important that we have access to the judges, have access to the whole legal proceedings for exactly the reasons you mentioned. And there's been a major change as well, hasn't there, Eve, now about journalists reporting from family courts in England and Wales. It's been described as a watershed moment, but effectively from the end of January, they can now speak to families in ongoing cases and report on what they hear in court and also quote from key documents as long as they maintain family anonymity. Is that the right way to do it, Eve?
I've done several stories on this one with lawyers with differing views. Some, as you say, Stephen, have the snobbish attitude, the right to privacy, but also on a deeper level, I think comes a very fundamental point of protection. Is a 10-year-old boy necessarily going to speak freely and truly about his experiences of abuse if he knows he is being filmed? There is that sort of self-inclining bias whereby if someone knows they're being filmed, especially someone vulnerable, then they will respond differently. Will it change the face of UK justice in the family court? Fundamentally, I don't think so within the next 10 years, but I do think it's a question to be raised. I think we need to make sure that we're protecting people. That is it necessary for the British public to know every single case that goes into the family court? Should that be freely available? It was once called press privilege, and now anybody will be able to look it up and write on it, not necessarily from a professional point of view. So that information, vulnerable information, will be at the hands of anyone who wants to write about it or create a documentary or what have you. So I think these are all important questions to consider.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and especially if somebody's proven to be, well, and proven not guilty, effectively, because it's up to the legal system to prove that they are guilty over here in England rather than the other way round. And as you say, if all the evidence against them is basically out there in the public domain afterwards, that could prejudice their life. So I think open access to everything has got its issue, hasn't it, Stephen?
Yes, but the family division has not benefited from a lack of sunlight. And it's fallen into it. There are two structural problems I think the family division has. One is that it allows really quite serious decisions to be made by really quite low-level judges. So if you just compare it with my type of court, they have the lowest level of judge really is district judge. And in the family division, so in my court, you have to have there's 3 levels: district judge, circuit judge, high court judge. Okay, high court judge is the top. In my court, only a high court judge can issue what's called a financial injunction. In the family division, a district judge can. That is a lot of power. It's an awful lot of power. They are effectively unappealable, and they sit there with complete anonymity. And I don't think that has assisted the family division. I think what we'd like to see is consistent judgments. I think particularly on ordinary access to children cases. And I'm not sure that we are seeing consistent judgment. So I'm hoping that press access will get that. Obviously, very highly sensitive care cases or cases of abuse are very different. But again, I have more faith in the judiciary, and I'm not criticizing district judges. I'm sure even district judges will defend children extremely well from any press risk. the total ban was probably going too far, and lifting that, it will learn delicately. We'll do it slowly, as we did in crime, and cameras only came in at the sentencing part with Mr. Justice Goose. That was the only bit, and only Mr. Justice Goose was shown. And I think that's absolutely right. I don't think that you should, conversely, I don't think you should film a public gallery. I learned, because I don't do criminal law, but I learned from some criminal colleagues that a lot of victims of crime simply cannot look at the perpetrator. So they only ever look at the judge. And I think it would be very traumatic if they were then on camera all the time. And, if people made nasty comments, and because they're just dealing with something. So I get that, but ultimately I trust our judges, and so I think getting rid of the blanket ban will hopefully help the family division, which will only be a good thing. I mean, that's the thing, because to be perfectly honest about the family division, you can walk into any pub in any medium-sized town and find a man who probably would be absolutely fine having access to his children, who can't get access to his children. And that needs a bit more standardization. I think kids need access to both parents, and, unless there's a risk of abuse. I'm for full disclosure, I'm in a shared parenting agreement. So, I do it too. And we pray for mama, and we take the other house seriously. It's part of who my child is, so it's I get it, but the family division has gone a bit off. It's not functioning. Most people can't access it because it's so expensive as well. That's the other problem.
About legal aid, there's a huge issue with it.
Yes, well, we barely give any.
Yeah, this one. I mean, the funding would be better placed in legal aid, I should suspect.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes, we could argue policy. But I always argue in favour of more access to justice and more legal aid.
Oh, it's got to be right, and but it's always I always quote that famous cartoon from the 18th century by J. Bright, which depicts litigation with a cow with the word litigation written on it, and the plaintiffs pulling the horns and the defendants pulling the tail, but it's the lawyers who are milking it. And I think this is what we need to do. You're absolutely right to raise the issue. There has to be access to justice for all. The other thing they try to standardize is obviously the sentencing, and we often talk about this. Stephen and I have shared many a platform talking about the sentencing council, where basically any judge looking at the evidence, looking at all the case and so on and so forth, will come to the same sentence. That's the idea. You have a certain tariff, and there are aggregating factors which make it a bit higher and mitigating factors which make it lower, but the general principle is that to standardize it, isn't it, Stephen?
That's the idea, and I think what you've seen is that standardized badness. I mean, particularly, I always raise paedophilic image cases. I think people who are in possession of paedophilic images, people certainly who make it, should go to prison, and for quite sizable periods of time. I don't want them. Yet time after time after time, they're walking out with suspended sentences. And effectively, and this is a timely question, because David Gork, who was a former Tory minister, is now working for the Labour government to review sentencing. And lo and behold, he thinks he's come up with his first report today. And lo and behold, it thinks exactly what they've all thought for exactly the last 30 years. Not a brain cell between them, not a new idea in their head. Apparently, we're sending too many people to prison and for too long. And apparently, we should send fewer people to prison for less long. Well, I think that's just bonkers. I think prolific shoplifters need to go to prison, because that's the only way you're going to stop them nicking stuff. And I think, things like paedophilic images need to go to prison. And I think we need to take prison much more seriously. By all means, reduce prison for those who don't need to be there. By all means, have rehabilitation programs and actually educate in prison. I was involved in getting a government to allow prisoners to undertake apprenticeships, so that they would learn practical skills while in prison, and then hopefully come out with a proper trade and therefore not end up back in prison. And I'm all for that. But there's this, we seem to be a naive society that refuses to recognize evil just does exist. And sometimes you got to lock it up. It's the only thing you can do.
But again, what you need is very clear rules for the judges, because the judges don't make the law, unless you're Lord Denning. You sort of turn around and you say, this is the way we've got to structure things. And the whole point about sentencing, there are three things it has to do. One is the punishment for the crime. The other is the deterrent. And the third thing is about rehabilitation. It's those aspects. What's your view on sentencing, Eve?
I am very against IPP sentencing. I think it's seen far too many people who have stolen a mobile phone, stuck behind bars for X amount of time, not seen their children grow up, etc. Also, an interesting point on the rehabilitation of prisoners. Several studies have shown that a lot of repeat offenders end up being institutionalized, and despite achievements within the institution, they then can't use them on the outside world. When it comes to shoplifting, I find there's a definite trend when it comes to the economy. And quite frankly, if somebody's shoplifting nappies and baby formula, I didn't see any crime. So, and a lot of people hold that view. But I'm not endorsing shoplifting, but that a lot of people do say if you see someone stealing food or what have you, is there a moral question there? Should we have people stealing food within our society? As our society not enabled its citizens to progress past the point of needing to steal? There's all the fundamental moral questions get raised. But when it comes to sentencing, yeah, I think harsher on paedophiles, quite frankly. And I think there needs to be more rape and sexual assault convictions. This needs to be happening. It's still at a very low percentage. It's far below, I think, still below 5%. It was at 1% for a long time. Getting your abuser to court as a female in this society is very difficult to do so, and when you get there it's even harder to convict, because then you've got the grey areas. So I think there needs to be what I think is good is the recognition of coercive control, financial abuse. All of these things are coming into the fold legally. But what I find is there's this catch-up element where we're not seeing the convictions. So, these sort of what people call softer abuses, they're often, small parts of a very big image. Often within one abuser who can commit many crimes are these small moving parts. So a recognition of that within law, and a law that recognises and encompasses that, and then that will lead to more accurate sentencing, I believe.
Okay, thank you for that. When we come back, we're going to be looking at when politics and law clashes. Don't touch that dial.
Critically analyzing global affairs, the Muckrakers.
For facts and truth.
Today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined yet again by Stephen Barrett and Tawfick, and we've been looking at media manipulation and talking about legal cases and how they might be manipulated, how there might be misunderstanding in the media. I want to look at how the law and politicians can sometimes clash. And we've got Lady Chief Justice Baroness Carr. She condemned both Starmer and Badenoch's comments in the Houses of Parliament. Talk us through that case, Stephen.
So it's not a case. What she did was she held a press conference this morning. She's the arguably the most senior judge in the country, and I have to say arguably because Tony Blair sort of messed everything up. We also used to know who the most senior judge in the country was. It used to be the Lord Chancellor. Then Tony Blair abolished the Lord Chancellor. Then Tony Blair had to bring the Lord Chancellor back because nothing worked without having a Lord Chancellor. So we have somebody called a Lord Chancellor, but they're not really the Lord Chancellor, and they don't really sit as a judge anymore. So we have a sort of slightly broken thing in the corner that calls itself the Lord Chancellor. It's currently Shabana Mahmood. And they're not the head of the judiciary. So if they're not the head of the judiciary, then who is? Well, is it the president of the Supreme Court? Is it the Master of the Rolls who's in charge of the Court of Appeal? And what we've all broadly agreed is that it should be the Lord Chief Justice, or the lady, as she now is, the Lady Chief Justice, is probably the most senior of the judges, is probably the older title, although Master of the Rolls might be older. But so she's the most senior judge. Her duty constitutionally is to be impartial and to be silent on political matters. So this press conference was a mistake, and I've been absolutely unequivocal about that. I tweeted about it as soon as I heard about it. I went on telly at midday to say this, and by about 3-4 o'clock, the leader of the opposition was in agreement with me. We don't know where the Prime Minister is, but constitutionally it is not right for a senior judge to try and tell off the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister for speaking in the House of Commons. Okay, that's not your role. Shush is basically what we need to get across to the Lady Chief Justice, but she felt that there'd been unfair criticism of a judge, and she would say that she felt, as the senior judge, if she probably is, touch wood, turn around three times, we all assume she is, it's her duty to look after this judge and to protect his feelings. And that's an interesting constitutional argument. I can see why she feels that. I just think it's wrong. And I don't think that judges should become so thin-skinned that they can't bear criticism. In the 1990s, the Sun newspaper referred to a then law lord, Lord Hoffman, as leg over Lenny, because he was photographed coming out of a famous strip club called Stringfellows. So the idea that we can't mock our judges or criticize our judges is for the birds. What this judge did was decide that in law, and I think this is a mistake of law, but he decided as law that because there is a refugee scheme for Ukraine, even though the government hasn't created one for Gaza, there must be one for Gaza. And so that's a judge creating a refugee scheme. That's very Lord Denning. But it's not acceptable. It's not surprising to me that politicians would criticize a judge who behaves that way. It's a mistake for the Lady Chief Justice to wade in. I'm going to do another written piece on my Substack about it, but she's really, it's an error. By this time tomorrow, we'll know where the Prime Minister is, because I suspect it will come up at Prime Minister's questions midday.
I'm sure it will. When I talk about the case, you're right as a general principle, the judges turning around and commenting on politicians and defending other judges. The case, however, because it is important to talk about that, the actual case it talked about was the Palestinian family from Gaza who applied to live in the UK under the Ukraine Family Scheme, which was initially intended for Ukrainian refugees. Their application was originally denied, and the family appealed and was granted the right to remain in the UK by the upper tribunal judges, citing Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. That was the case to which they're referring. But you're right, the reaction, because what they did, Prime Minister's questions, Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch criticised the judicial decision as completely wrong and urged for an appeal or new legislation to clarify immigration rules. And Sir Keir Starmer agreed that the decision was wrong and stated that the government would close the legal loophole allowing this case to occur. He then emphasised that Parliament should make the rules on immigration. That's when the Lady Chief Justice, Baroness Carr, condemned both Starmer and Badenoch's comments. So that was the case they were referring to, but it's a criticism by the judges and politicians, vice versa. What are your views on all of that, Eve?
So when it comes to the general attitude of Ukraine v Gaza, I found it very interesting when we first heard of Ukraine, the reaction of the public to the people misplaced by war, as opposed to those in the Middle East. And I think this is a great representation of that. And I think people on social media's reaction to it is a representation of it as well. You know, the negative reaction, how dare they? And also then you've got the public facing, the judge creating the fund, etc. That's when I talk about self-censorship, in a way, this is what I mean. What should one do? How should one act? How should I appear? How, these questions are things that people are asking themselves daily. And what we've seen of this judge is a very human action, now has become a very daily human action of, how many likes is this going to get? So I think that's where it comes from. You know, if I've done one from Ukraine, I should do one to Gaza, lest I get criticised. So, but underneath all of that, is human struggle and human suffering. And I think people have reacted very negatively over the years to asylum seekers and refugees from the Middle East and surrounding areas. As somebody who is half Egyptian myself, obviously I feel for that cause. Just because they're brown doesn't mean they're not welcome. But with Ukraine, it was, we're seeing blonde-haired, blue-eyed people in distress. Oh, that's me. Oh, I feel for that. Please come in. So it's quite upsetting to watch the UK react to that in that manner, and likewise with this case.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to turn to a couple of other things which have been in the news recently, again, where the media, social media in particular, burst a blood vessel. And there was an initial case where judges in Ireland ordered the media not to report on migrant crimes because of what they called an unfortunate climate fueled by social media. What this was, it was a case that's now been revealed, an Indian man, Visak Rajev Leela. He was charged with attempting to abduct a young boy from an apartment block in Dublin. He appeared in Dublin District Court, and there were reporting the restrictions initially because they thought about the sensitivity of the case and the current climate. It was requested not to say any about the identity and so on and so forth. Stephen, what are your views on restricting people in those situations in case it could be too inflammatory?
It's a really stupid idea in a dictatorship. It's beyond madness in a democracy. It's just an insane idea. The idea that social media causes violence is one of the great ills of our age. It's not, people don't have an emotional reaction to a tweet. People have an emotional reaction to the events the tweet explains. And if the events are true, then why on earth could you on what basis would you censor their emotional reaction? And it's not just because somebody has an emotional reaction doesn't mean that they're going to go out and commit unlawful violence either. That's a terribly patronizing idea and one we need to really nip in the bud. But ultimately, in a democracy, the leaders should fear the people, not the people fear the leaders. And I'm afraid that the leaders are trying to do a switcheroo on this, and it's not going to work. I've called, I think the thinking of the Lady Chief Justice that we just talked about is in this category. But I've got a phrase called Versailles thinking, and it basically describes anybody who thinks, as they did in France in the Palace of Versailles, that a small group of humans are so elite and marvelous and absolutely perfect that they're really much better than the large mass of people outside. Well, I'm afraid that only ever ends one way in human societies, and it's with those allegedly elite people with their heads in baskets. So I really don't want us to go down the route of Versailles thinking, because it's just a stupid idea. What we should be is an open, pluralistic democracy where everybody's opinion matters, and we should be a democracy that tells the truth as well. There is an inherent value to truth. There is no inherent value to the state or the government trying to manage the citizens. It's a stupid thing to do, and it needs to stop.
And undoubtedly, what happens, it's predictably as well, is that it led to controversy. As soon as you have reporting restrictions, online agitators basically were arguing that the state was covering up crime by immigrants, is what they were saying. And they were talking about this two-tier justice system. Were they right to impose reporting restrictions, Eve?
I don't necessarily think they were correct, and largely agree with Stephen, but I'll play devil's advocate in this case. The minute the public is going to see this foreign name, they're immediately going to link it to religion, which leads to, underlying Islamophobia, which I think is still rife within British society and overseas as well. And they're going to judge him based upon that, which could then lead potentially to attacks on, businesses owned by people of that faith, or attacks on people wearing burqas or what have you. And I think that was the thinking behind that. Not everybody with a funny second name is Islamic, obviously, but I think that was the thinking, to protect him, and not just him as a criminal, but to protect those businesses and those people. Because as we've seen, when the British start rioting, they do it with zeal. There's fires, there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on, and you might just nip in and get yourself a plasma TV. So I just feel it was done in with the right kind of thinking, and I do believe in protecting minority groups. I will never say that is the wrong thing to do, but then it got turned around, twisted, and it's become, well, you're protecting this group over our own. What does this criminal deserve your protection for? But largely I do agree with what Stephen's saying.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, justice is supposed to be blind, and on that sort of basis, the rule is you have this disclosure, then it applies to everybody. It doesn't matter about colour, race, creed, or sexual orientation, or any of that sort of side. It has to work uniformly. I want to also look, and this is something Stephen raised as well, about the unease regarding Jonathan Reynolds' suitability for his role as Business and Trade Secretary, particularly with Donald Trump as president, due to his perceived inadequacies in his professional background. Talk us through that, Stephen.
So for 14 years, he's been making public statements that he is a solicitor. The only reason he could have been making those statements is because he thinks that benefits him somehow, and that the public might perhaps think he's cleverer because he's a solicitor. Perhaps they think he's more honest because he's a solicitor. Perhaps they think he's done more work in the private sector. But for whatever reason, he's been doing it in order to benefit from the fact that he was a solicitor. He is not a solicitor. And he's more than clever enough to know that he never was a solicitor. And so he should never have at any stage been saying that. Now, there's going to be attempts to sort of, unfortunately, posing as a solicitor is a crime. It's a bit like posing like a police officer because they are officers of the court. Posing as a barrister is a crime, but it's a lesser one because actually it's the solicitors who have all of the power, really. People don't know this, but solicitors are officers of the court. Barristers are not. Although we may have higher status, we don't have all the doodahs and bells and whistles that they have. So being a solicitor has always been a very serious thing, and pretending to be one has been a crime for a very long time. I don't think he'll be found guilty of that crime, and I don't want to focus on the technicality of the illegality. We need to get morality back. This is an immoral thing to do. This is something that a minister of the Crown should not have ever done. And any minister of the Crown of any party, Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative, who spends 14 years sending their solicitor when they aren't, should resign.
Yeah, it's very clear, and there's been all sorts of accusations about Rachel Reeves and the fabricated CVs and the exaggeration about nearly a decade and so on and so forth. But as you say, under the Solicitors Act 1974, using the title solicitor without proper registration is illegal. Eve, do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I mean, who hasn't smudged a CV or two? You could argue. But to this extent, absolutely not. I think it's ridiculous. I think, much like with the army, stolen valor, that's someone else's hours, that's somebody else's hard work, that's somebody else's title. You do not have a right to it. And I think it's a very narcissistic, slimy move. It's also, I think, reveals what he feels about others. If I have a good job, therefore I am more worthy. If I am educated, I am more worthy, and therefore should be treated as such. I think it's absolutely abhorrent, and I hope no woman dates him ever again.
Well, there you go. No woman dates him. That'll be a worse punishment than the illegal
man,
stuff.
whatever he likes.
He's not a man. Whatever he wants. It sounds good. Both of you have been absolutely brilliant today. Thank you so much for coming on the Muckrakers. I did promise that you can do your shameless plug at the end. Stephen, 10 seconds. How can people find you?
So I am on Substack mostly, and if you just put Stephen Barrett Substack into a search engine, you'll get my Substack, which is called Public Gallery.
There we go. Very easy. Eve, how can people find you?
Eve Tawfick Muckrak for my portfolio and my crazy stories. There's some weird ones, so you definitely want to look me up. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, all under Eve Rami or Eve Tawfick. X, I'm working on. I've forgotten all the passwords, but I'll create a killer one to be sure. Lovely to see you both.
It's so good to see both of you. Stephen Barrett, Eve Tawfick, thank you so much for joining me here on the Muckrakers. Tomorrow, a revelation. We've got Roger Stone coming on the show to talk about who really assassinated JFK. Do not miss that. Join me right here on The Pulse today. I've been Andrew Eborn. You've been great. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you same time tomorrow.